Picture a phone call that never happened. In the fall of 1956, the President of the United States wanted to know what his closest wartime ally was planning to do in Egypt. He didn't find out from London. He found out from the CIA, from intercepted cables, from newspapers. Britain, the country that had stood beside America at Normandy, that had shared its darkest secrets and its deepest alliance for a generation, had gone to war without telling Washington a single word. And when Dwight Eisenhower found out, he didn't send troops to help. He didn't send warships. He picked up the most powerful weapon in the American arsenal, one that had nothing to do with bombs or bullets, and he pointed it directly at the British economy. Within days, one of the oldest empires in human history was on its knees, not because it lost a war, but because it lost the ability to pay for one. That is the real story of Suez, not a canal, not a war. A phone call that never came, and a debt that came due. Most people who have heard of the Suez Crisis know the shape of it in outline. Egypt, a canal, a war, an embarrassment. But almost nobody understands what actually happened underneath the headlines, and that's a shame, because 1956 is arguably the single most important year in the story of how the modern Middle East came to exist, and how the torch of Western power passed from an old empire in London to a new one in Washington. This wasn't a slow, graceful handover. It was a public humiliation, engineered deliberately by a president who had once commanded British troops as the supreme Allied commander in Europe, and who now, just over a decade later, was willing to bankrupt his own allies to stop them from doing something he believed was catastrophically stupid. So let's actually understand what happened, not the Wikipedia summary. The real mechanics of how an empire that ruled a quarter of the Earth's surface got outmaneuvered by its own former subordinate in the space of about 10 days. To understand Suez, you have to understand what the canal actually meant to Britain, because to modern eyes it just looks like a strip of water in the desert. It wasn't. The Suez Canal, completed in 1869 by French engineers under Ferdinand de Lesseps, cut straight through Egyptian territory and connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Before it existed, a ship sailing from London to Bombay had to go all the way around the southern tip of Africa, a journey of months. After it existed, that same journey could be cut by thousands of miles. For the British Empire, which by the 20th century stretched from Canada to Australia to India to huge swaths of Africa, the canal wasn't just convenient. It was the spinal cord of the entire imperial system. It was how troops, mail, trade goods, and administrators moved between London and the crown jewel of the empire, India. Britain had bought a controlling stake in the Suez Canal Company back in 1875, and by the mid-20th century, alongside French shareholders, it effectively owned and operated one of the most strategically important waterways on the planet. And by the 1950s, there was an added dimension that made the canal even more critical: oil. Roughly two-thirds of Europe's oil supply moved through the Suez Canal from the fields of the Persian Gulf. Whoever controlled that choke point didn't just control trade. They controlled whether the lights stayed on in London, Paris, and every industrial city in Western Europe. Now layer onto that the man who was about to become Britain's problem. Gamal Abdel Nasser was a young Egyptian army colonel who, in 1952, had helped lead a coup that overthrew King Farouk, a monarch widely seen as a corrupt puppet propped up by British influence. By 1954, Nasser had consolidated power and become president, and he represented something the old colonial order in the Middle East had never really had to deal with before: a genuinely popular, charismatic Arab nationalist leader who spoke directly to ordinary people across the region through radio broadcasts, and who explicitly rejected the idea that Egypt, or any Arab nation, should continue taking its marching orders from London or Paris. Nasser wanted Egypt to modernize, and the crown jewel of his development plan was the Aswan High Dam, a massive hydroelectric and irrigation project on the Nile that he believed would transform Egypt's economy. Britain and the United States had initially agreed to help finance construction. But Nasser was also playing a dangerous game of non-alignment during the Cold War, buying arms from communist Czechoslovakia and flirting openly with the Soviet bloc while still asking the West for development money. Washington and London saw this as an insult they weren't willing to swallow, and in July of 1956, they abruptly withdrew their offer to fund the dam. Nasser's response was not what anyone in London expected. On July 26, 1956, in a fiery speech delivered from Alexandria, Nasser announced that he was nationalizing the Suez Canal Company. Egypt would now own and operate the canal outright, and Nasser calculated that the tolls collected from the ships passing through it would pay for the Aswan Dam within about 5 years, without a single dollar of Western financing. It was a bold, almost theatrical move, and it detonated a crisis that within a matter of months would end a prime minister's career, humiliate two great European powers, and permanently rearrange the balance of power in the Middle East. For the British government, and specifically for Prime Minister Anthony Eden, the nationalization wasn't just a commercial dispute. It was existential. Eden had a very specific historical lens through which he viewed the world, forged in the 1930s when he had resigned as Foreign Secretary in protest of Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasing Hitler and Mussolini. Eden had watched Europe's leaders make excuse after excuse for dictators who kept testing the limits of what the world would tolerate, and he had watched where that road led. Now, in his mind, he was looking at another dictator testing the West, and he was determined not to repeat the mistake of the 1930s. He began comparing Nasser to Mussolini in private conversations and cabinet meetings, convinced that if Nasser was allowed to simply seize a major Western asset without consequence, it would embolden every anti-colonial movement across the Middle East and Africa, and Britain's entire imperial position would unravel. It's worth pausing here because this is one of the great tragic ironies of the Suez Crisis. Eden believed he was applying the hard lesson of appeasement. In reality, he was about to make a completely different kind of catastrophic misjudgment, one rooted not in the dangers of the 1930s, but in a fundamental failure to understand that the world of 1956 was not the world of 1938. The age of European gunboat diplomacy dictating terms to the rest of the planet was ending, whether Eden accepted that or not. France had its own reasons for wanting Nasser gone. Egypt was providing support to Algerian rebels fighting for independence from French colonial rule, and French leaders saw Nasser as a destabilizing force fueling anti-colonial uprisings across North Africa. And then there was Israel, which had its own separate and very serious grievances against Egypt. Nasser had been blockading the Straits of Turin, choking off Israeli shipping access to the port of Eilat, and Egypt had been sponsoring cross-border raids into Israeli territory. Israel was also alarmed by Egypt's growing arms purchases from the Soviet bloc, which threatened to tip the regional military balance. So you had three countries, Britain, France, and Israel, each with completely different underlying motivations, but all converging on the same conclusion. Nasser needed to go, or at the very least, be decisively humiliated and stripped of control over the canal. What happened next is one of the most remarkable examples of international deception in 20th century diplomacy, and for decades afterward, the governments involved simply denied it had happened at all. In October of 1956, senior officials from Britain, France, and Israel met in near-total secrecy at a private villa in the Paris suburb of Sèvres. Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion attended personally, along with his foreign minister and his military chief of staff. The French were represented by their prime minister and foreign minister. Britain sent its foreign secretary along with a senior diplomat, while Eden himself stayed away from the room and communicated by messages, likely to preserve a thin layer of deniability. Over the course of these secret talks, the three governments hammered out what became known as the Protocol of Sèvres, a written plan for a coordinated, choreographed war dressed up as an accident. The plan was this. Israel would invade the Sinai Peninsula and advance toward the Suez Canal. Britain and France would then step in publicly, not as co-conspirators, but as supposedly neutral peacekeepers, issuing an ultimatum demanding that both Israel and Egypt withdraw from the canal zone. Egypt, obviously, would refuse to withdraw from its own sovereign territory. And that refusal would give Britain and France their pretext to launch a military intervention and seize the canal by force, all while pretending to the world, and specifically to the United States, that they were simply separating two warring parties rather than executing a prearranged invasion they had planned all along. The document was signed on October 24, 1956. Afterward, wanting to erase any trace of what had just happened, Eden reportedly ordered the British copy of the protocol destroyed. The French misplaced theirs. For years, all three governments flatly denied any prior coordination had taken place. It was Israel, decades later, that preserved the clearest surviving copies in its own archives, a strange historical footnote given that Israel was the junior partner in a scheme largely designed to save face for two declining European empires. The plan unfolded almost exactly as scripted. On October 29, 1956, Israeli forces crossed into the Sinai Peninsula and advanced rapidly toward the canal. Right on cue, Britain and France issued their joint ultimatum the following day, demanding both sides pull back 10 miles from the canal, fully expecting, indeed counting on, Egypt's refusal. Nasser refused. On October 31st, British and French aircraft began bombing Egyptian airfields, and by early November, paratroopers and seaborne forces were landing at Port Said at the northern entrance of the canal. And this is where the story stops being a Middle Eastern regional conflict and becomes something much bigger, a direct and open confrontation between Britain and the United States, conducted not with weapons but with money. Dwight Eisenhower was furious, and it is genuinely hard to overstate how furious. He had learned about the coordinated attack largely through American intelligence rather than through any advance warning from London or Paris, and to him, this wasn't just a breach of protocol. It was a fundamental betrayal of trust from allies he had personally led into battle against the Nazis just over a decade earlier. But Eisenhower's anger wasn't purely personal. It was rooted in cold, hard strategic calculation, and understanding his reasoning is the key to understanding everything that happened afterward. First, Eisenhower was in the final stretch of a presidential re-election campaign in 1956, and he had built his entire foreign policy identity around peace, stability, and opposition to old-style colonial aggression. Second, and far more consequentially, this crisis erupted in the very same week that Soviet tanks were rolling into Budapest to crush the Hungarian uprising. Eisenhower had spent days publicly condemning Soviet aggression in Hungary as a naked act of imperial force against a smaller nation's sovereignty. If the United States now stayed silent, or worse, tacitly supported Britain and France doing almost exactly the same thing to Egypt, the entire moral authority of America's Cold War position would evaporate overnight. Every non-aligned nation watching from Cairo to New Delhi to Jakarta would conclude that Western talk of freedom and sovereignty was pure hypocrisy, and that conclusion would be a gift to Moscow. Third, and this is the piece that gets underappreciated, Eisenhower had a genuinely different worldview than Eden. He believed, correctly as it turned out, that the era of European colonial control over the developing world was ending, and that trying to reverse that tide by force in 1956 was not just morally troubling but strategically doomed. Clinging to the empire, in Eisenhower's view, would only push newly independent and soon-to-be independent nations straight into the arms of the Soviet Union. So Eisenhower moved. And what he did next stands as one of the most striking demonstrations in modern history of financial power, substituting for military power between two allied nations. Britain's economy in 1956 was in a far more fragile position than most Britons realized at the time. The country was still working through the immense debts it had accumulated fighting the Second World War, debts owed in large part to the United States itself under wartime lending arrangements. British foreign currency reserves stood at roughly $2.2 billion in the autumn of 1956. By comparison, the United States government alone held roughly $3.75 billion in British debt from a 1945 loan agreement. The British pound, still one of the world's major reserve currencies at the time, was already under intense speculative pressure as investors, spooked by the war and its costs, began selling sterling and driving its value down. Chancellor of the Exchequer Harold Macmillan, who just months earlier had been confidently telling colleagues that America would quietly tolerate the operation, watched the pound come under sustained attack in currency markets as the invasion proceeded. Britain turned to the International Monetary Fund for an emergency loan to defend the pound and stop the run on its currency. Normally, this kind of request between allies would have been a formality. Instead, the Eisenhower administration made its position unmistakably clear through the Treasury Department. There would be no support from the IMF and no support from the Export-Import Bank, unless and until Britain agreed to an immediate ceasefire and a full withdrawal from Egypt. This wasn't a suggestion. It was economic pressure applied with surgical precision, at the exact moment Britain could least afford to resist it. And behind that pressure sat an even bigger, more devastating threat. Washington signaled that it was prepared to actively sell off part of the United States government's own holdings of British sterling bonds, a move that would have flooded the market, crushed the value of the pound even further, and potentially triggered a full-blown currency collapse. For a nation whose entire post-war economic survival depended on maintaining confidence in its currency and its ability to import food, fuel, and raw materials, this was not a bluff Britain could afford to call. Within days, the operation that had seemed unstoppable simply stopped. On November 6, 1956, the very same day American voters were re-electing Eisenhower in a landslide, and the same day British paratroopers were still fighting inside Port Said, Anthony Eden announced a ceasefire. British and French forces had achieved their military objectives on the ground. They controlled significant stretches of the canal. And it did not matter in the slightest, because they had lost the fight that actually determined the outcome, the fight over money. It was one of the starkest illustrations in modern history that owning territory means nothing if you cannot afford to hold it. The aftermath unfolded quickly and, for Britain, painfully. A ceasefire was one thing, but an actual resolution required getting foreign troops out of Egypt entirely. The solution came from an unlikely direction: Canada's foreign minister, Lester Pearson, who proposed creating the first-ever United Nations emergency force, a genuinely neutral international peacekeeping body that could be deployed to supervise the withdrawal of British, French, and Israeli forces and stand between the parties going forward. It was a groundbreaking innovation in international diplomacy, and Pearson would later win the Nobel Peace Prize for the idea. By December of 1956, British and French troops had withdrawn from Egyptian territory entirely. Israeli forces held out somewhat longer, finally completing their withdrawal from the Sinai in March of 1957, though not before securing some assurances regarding shipping access through the Straits of Turin. Back home in Britain, the consequences were immediate and humiliating. The canal itself, meanwhile, had been blocked by ships that Egypt deliberately scuttled during the fighting, and it stayed closed to traffic for months, disrupting oil shipments and forcing Britain into fuel rationing that lasted from December 1956 all the way into May of 1957. Ordinary British citizens who had been told this was a mission to protect a vital national interest instead found themselves standing in petrol queues, watching their prime minister's authority crumble in real time. When the canal did reopen in the spring of 1957, it reopened under full, undisputed Egyptian ownership and control, precisely the outcome Britain and France had gone to war to prevent. And then there was Anthony Eden himself. The man who had once resigned from government in protest of appeasement now found his own premiership collapsing under the weight of a very different kind of miscalculation. Eden's health, which had been fragile since a botched gallbladder surgery years earlier, deteriorated badly under the stress of the crisis. He was reportedly relying heavily on stimulant medication just to function through the worst weeks of the affair. In November, he flew to Jamaica for weeks to recover, leaving his government essentially rudderless at the exact moment Britain needed clear leadership to manage the diplomatic fallout. He returned in December, but the political damage was already done. He had also misled the House of Commons, denying any foreknowledge of Israel's attack on Egypt, a denial that grew harder and harder to sustain as details of the Sevres collusion slowly leaked out over the following years. On January 9, 1957, less than 2 years after becoming Prime Minister, Anthony Eden resigned, officially citing his failing health. His successor, fittingly, was Harold Macmillan, the very chancellor who had watched the pound come under attack and who had pushed hardest within cabinet for an immediate end to the operation once the financial reality became clear. Macmillan would go on to preside over Britain's accelerating retreat from empire throughout the following decade. But here is the part of the story that turned Suez from simply a British embarrassment into a genuine hinge point in 20th century history, the part your thumbnail is really pointing at. While Britain was being humbled, the United States was actively, deliberately stepping into the space Britain was vacating. This was not incidental. It was policy. Just 2 months after Eden's resignation, on January 5, 1957, before Eden had even left office, Eisenhower stood before a joint session of Congress and outlined what would become known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. The doctrine committed the United States to providing economic and, if necessary, military assistance to any Middle Eastern nation that requested help, resisting what Eisenhower termed armed aggression from any country controlled by international communism. Congress would go on to authorize roughly $200 million a year in aid for the following 2 years under this framework. On paper, the doctrine was framed entirely around the Soviet threat. In practice, everyone involved understood what it actually represented, an explicit American declaration that the United States, not an exhausted and financially humbled Britain, was now the guarantor of Western interests across the Middle East. The old imperial patron had been replaced by a new superpower patron, and the transition had happened in the space of about 6 months. The irony here is almost too clean for fiction. Eisenhower had just spent the crisis punishing Britain financially specifically to stop it from acting as an old-style imperial power dictating outcomes in the Middle East by force. And within weeks of that humiliation being complete, the United States announced its own doctrine for intervening in exactly the same region, backed by exactly the kind of financial and military muscle that made such intervention credible. Washington wasn't rejecting the idea of Western influence over the Middle East. It was rejecting the idea that Britain and France, rather than the United States, should be the ones exercising it. Over the following 18 months, Eisenhower would go on to invoke his own doctrine directly, sending American troops into Lebanon in the summer of 1958 to prevent what officials feared was a pro-Nasser, pro-Soviet uprising from toppling the pro-Western government there. It was the first major American military deployment in the Middle East of the Cold War era, and it set a template of direct American involvement in the region's internal politics that has, in one form or another, continued for the better part of 7 decades since. Nasser, meanwhile, emerged from the crisis in a position that almost nobody in London or Paris had anticipated. Militarily, Egypt had actually lost on the battlefield. British, French, and Israeli forces had achieved their tactical objectives before the ceasefire was imposed from Washington. But politically, Nasser became the single biggest winner of the entire affair. He had stood up to 2 former colonial powers, and thanks to American pressure rather than his own army, watched them withdraw in humiliation. Across the Arab world, he became an icon of a new, assertive post-colonial nationalism, a leader who had defied Europe and survived, even thrived. His prestige soared not just in Egypt but across Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and beyond, fueling nationalist and anti-Western movements throughout the region for years afterward. The Soviet Union, for its part, moved quickly to capitalize on the moment, eventually stepping in to finance the Aswan High Dam that America and Britain had refused to fund in the first place, deepening Moscow's foothold in Egypt for the following decade and a half. Nikita Khrushchev had also sent Britain and France pointed diplomatic warnings during the crisis, hinting at the possibility of Soviet intervention, though most historians today agree it was the American financial pressure, not Soviet threats, that actually forced the ceasefire. Still, the optics mattered enormously. To much of the world watching, it looked as though the Soviet Union had stood with the Arab world against European imperialism, a propaganda win Moscow didn't have to lift a finger to fully earn. So what actually changed after 1956? In the most literal sense, quite a lot changed almost immediately. Britain's self-image as a global power capable of independently projecting military force to secure its interests anywhere on Earth was shattered in a matter of days, not by an enemy army, but by an ally's bank account. The phrase that later entered common usage among British officials and historians, east of Suez, came to describe the entire retreat that followed, as Britain spent the next 15 years progressively withdrawing its military commitments from the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, formally announcing in 1968 that it would pull back almost all remaining forces stationed east of the Mediterranean by the early 1970s. The special relationship between Britain and America, badly strained by Eisenhower's willingness to financially punish an ally, was eventually patched back together, notably at a Bermuda summit between Macmillan and Eisenhower in early 1957. But it was patched back together on new terms, terms in which everyone now understood clearly which of the two nations was the senior partner and which was the junior one. That hierarchy, established unmistakably in the humiliating weeks of November 1956, has essentially held ever since. It's also worth sitting with what this looked like for ordinary people on both sides of the Atlantic, because the headlines and the doctrines tend to erase the human texture underneath them. In Britain, this wasn't an abstract diplomatic embarrassment happening somewhere far away. Families had sons serving in port said. Petrol rationing meant real Britain standing in real lines at real gas stations, for the first time since the Second World War had ended over a decade earlier, a genuinely jarring reminder of just how much the country's post-war recovery still rested on a knife's edge. Newspapers that had cheered the operation in its opening days were, within weeks, printing furious editorials asking how a nation that had defeated Hitler could be brought to heel so quickly by its own ally. There was real public anger, real protest in the streets of London against the war, and a real sense among ordinary citizens that something fundamental about Britain's place in the world had just quietly ended, even if nobody could quite articulate what that something was yet. On the American side, most citizens barely registered Suez as anything more than a distant flare-up overshadowed by the Hungarian uprising and the re-election campaign. Few Americans in November of 1956 understood that their own government had just used the machinery of international finance to force a wartime ally into retreat, and fewer still understood that the doctrine their president would announce 2 months later was effectively a down payment on decades of direct American entanglement in the Middle East, entanglement that would eventually touch far more American lives, through oil crises, through wars, through decades of foreign policy, than almost anyone watching the news in early 1957 could have imagined. For the United States, Suez marked a genuine turning point in how it saw its own role in the world. Before 1956, American involvement in Middle Eastern affairs had been real but comparatively limited, focused mostly on oil interests and early Cold War maneuvering. After Suez, the United States positioned itself explicitly and publicly as the region's primary external power broker, a role it has never fully relinquished since. Through the decades of Cold War competition that followed, through the oil shocks of the 1970s, through the Gulf Wars, and into the conflicts of the 21st century, it's not an exaggeration to say that the framework Eisenhower laid out in January of 1957, American money and American power filling the vacuum left by a retreating European empire, became the basic operating model for American Middle East policy for the following 2 generations. There's a broader lesson buried inside this story too, one that goes beyond Britain, beyond Egypt, beyond even the Middle East. Suez is one of the clearest demonstrations in modern history that raw military capability and actual geopolitical power are not the same thing. Britain and France won every battle they fought in the autumn of 1956. Their troops took their objectives. Their military plan worked exactly as designed. And none of it mattered because, in the interconnected financial system of the 20th century, the country that controls the currency, the credit lines, and the reserve system holds a form of leverage that can override military success entirely. Eisenhower didn't need to fire a single shot at his own allies. He simply had to remind them whose economy their economy actually depended on. That is a lesson that has echoed through the decades since, in trade disputes, in sanctions regimes, in the ongoing debates over who really holds power in a globalized economy, the country with the tanks, or the country that decides whether your currency is worth anything tomorrow morning. What's remarkable, looking back from where we sit today, is how quickly and quietly this handover happened. There was no formal treaty transferring influence over the Middle East from London to Washington. There was no ceremony, no signing, no headline the next morning announcing a change of global leadership. It happened through a ceasefire announcement, a currency crisis, a doctrine speech to Congress, and a prime minister's resignation letter, all compressed into about 5 months between July of 1956 and January of 1957. Empires, it turns out, don't always fall in a single dramatic battle. Sometimes they just quietly run out of money at the worst possible moment, and somebody else is standing right there, checkbook in hand, ready to take over the lease. If you found this one genuinely interesting, if it changed how you think about how power actually moves between nations, that's exactly the kind of history this channel exists for. The moments that don't get taught properly in a 10-minute classroom overview, but that quietly explain the world you're actually living in today. Sticking around and subscribing means more of these stories land in your feed instead of getting buried, and it genuinely helps a channel like this keep going. So if that's something you want, you know where the button is. And I'm curious about something. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the country you're watching this from. I want to see just how far this story is traveling. While you're down there, tell me what you think was the real turning point of this whole crisis. Was it the Severs Protocol? Was it the moment Eisenhower turned off the money? Or was it Nasser's speech in Alexandria that started the entire chain reaction? I'll be reading through the comments, so let me know. I'll see you in the next one.